Let's start with the idea that the American dream isn't really about policies or laws. It's more like a story. It unfolds with a structure, filled with symbols and rituals that shape how we live, how we work, and even how we see ourselves. And this story, or really this myth, has been told in countless forms over the years. At its core, it follows a familiar arc: struggle, sacrifice, and eventually success. It's a pattern that's echoed across generations. Think about how the American dream gets communicated. It's not just in advertising, but in the stories we absorb and reproduce. A film like American Beauty takes that polished image of suburban success and slowly dismantles it. The house, the job, the perfectly manicured lawn, they're all symbols of having made it. But they mask a deep sense of disconnection and dissatisfaction. That's the thing. Places like suburbs, schools, even TV sitcoms aren't just physical or cultural artifacts. They operate like scaffolding for a larger narrative. They quietly teach us what a successful life is supposed to look like, even when that script no longer fits the reality we're living. What's especially striking is how deeply this myth shapes not just individual aspirations, but the culture at large. Narratology, the study of how stories function, lets us see the American dream not as a benign ideal, but as a kind of narrative operating system. It's how we organize meaning, assign value, and orient ourselves socially. But like any story, it's subject to revision. The dream doesn't stay frozen in time. It morphs depending on who's telling it, who's left out of it, and what the cultural moment demands. That evolution, or fracture, is what makes it worth re-examining now. When you look at the dream through this lens, you realize that it's not just about hard work or achieving success. It's about maintaining this cultural narrative that we all buy into, whether consciously or not. It's kind of a social script we've internalized, and we measure our lives against it. But here's the question. If it's a story, what happens when that story no longer resonates? When the symbols or the message feels, fractured? If we think of the American dream as a story, then like all stories, it reflects its time, right? And over the decades, this story has shifted dramatically. The post-war years, for example, embodied this sense of resolution and conformity. It was simple: achieve success through marriage, home ownership, and stability. Shows like Leave It to Beaver painted this very domestic ideal, almost like a blueprint for what life should look like. But then, things began to change. By the 1970s, the cracks in the narrative started to show. The heroes became a little more, lost, just wandering through worlds that didn't offer clear answers anymore. Think about films like Taxi Driver or Five Easy Pieces, protagonists without perfect arcs. Disillusionment was the mood. Suddenly the dream wasn't so neat, it felt fragile, distant. And then jump forward to the 1990s, which honestly felt like a shift into irony, that sort of postmodern detachment. There wasn't hope or clarity, just this fragmented sense of identity. You saw it in Fight Club, Generation X culture. It was all about questioning the very idea of success. How do you chase a dream you don't believe in? And now when you think about the 2000s up to today, the dream feels, atomized. Everyone's curating their own version of it, right? Influencer culture, the gig economy. Those are all micro dreams, personal lives built for display. Success has become performative, almost tailored to algorithms rather than people. But here's the thing, with all this fragmenting, does the dream still hold together as one coherent story? Or has it splintered into too many pieces to matter anymore? So let's talk about narratology as this fascinating tool for decoding stories. It isn't just about looking at what a story says on the surface. It's about, pulling back the layers to see how it's built. The structure, the symbols, the roles people play, and then asking who gets to tell it. Narratology really opens up this whole other dimension to understanding myths like the American dream that we sometimes take for granted. Think of it this way. If we study the dream as a story, it's not just about the promises it makes. It's also about the characters. Who gets cast as the hero? Who's the sidekick or maybe the villain? And more importantly, who isn't even in the story at all? Those missing voices actually say a lot about the culture holding onto the myth. They highlight gaps, exclusions, blind spots. And, something narratology reveals is that these roles, the hero, the helper, even the obstacles, They shape not just how the story unfolds, but also how we see ourselves fitting into it. Like, when society tells a story where success looks a certain way, white picket fence, steady job, all that, it sends a pretty strong message about who's allowed to feel like they belong and who isn't. What's really compelling here is how narratology shows us that no story, not even the American dream, is static. These myths evolve because culture evolves, and as more people try to tell their own versions of the dream or push back against it, the structure changes. But the thing is, when a story stops including everyone, or when the arc itself starts to feel, I guess, off, it loses its power. It doesn't land the same way. And that's where we start to see the fractures. Here's the thing. If a story is supposed to guide us, to give us meaning, what happens when that story starts to break down? And that's where we are, I think, with the American dream. It feels like it's fallen out of step with reality. You know, merit feels, well, manufactured. We hear these stories of success, but behind the scenes, nepotism, legacy admissions, privilege, it's everywhere. It's like the very idea that if you work hard, you'll succeed, it's eroding. And I think we feel that disconnect. And then there's stability. Stability's become conditional, hasn't it? For so many people, there's no clear path anymore. Student debt, rising rents, the gig economy. It's like even when you think you're doing all the right things, the foundation feels shaky, uncertain. That sense of security that the dream once promised, it's not there. It sort of makes you realize just how fragile this whole narrative really is. But maybe the biggest issue is simply narrative fatigue. I mean, think about it. We keep being told the same story, that everything will get better if we just try harder, but it doesn't end in the resolution we're used to. There are no clear heroes today, no villains you can point to and say, they're the problem. The stories we see now, even in our media, reflect this hazy, unresolved tension. Take shows like Succession or Euphoria. There's no moral clarity, no satisfying conclusion. It's like the arcs themselves are stalling out before they finish. And when stories fail to inspire or even make sense, people start to look elsewhere for answers, for meaning. That's where we see, conspiracy myths like QAnon or flat earth theories stepping in. They're chaotic, but they fill a void left by the collapsing main story. So really what we're seeing isn't just a rejection of the dream, it's a scramble for something, anything to replace it. Here's where it gets interesting. What if generative AI could help us reimagine myth, not just mimic it? These models like GPT aren't storytellers in the traditional sense. They're associative engines, remixing language based on patterns across vast cultural data sets. But that's precisely what makes them useful. They surface connections we might overlook, free from our usual filters, habits, and blind spots. In that way, Gen AI becomes less a tool for producing finished stories and more a partner in speculative thinking. It pushes us past inherited tropes and offers raw symbolic material we can shape into new narratives, ones that reflect not just where we've been, but where we could go. As an extension of our creative intelligence, it doesn't replace myth-making. It expands its possibilities. Now, AI doesn't know truth. It doesn't reason. What it does is produce what some people call hallucinations, synthetic narratives that might seem coherent, but also feel, kind of off, like a dream you can't quite remember right. And on the surface, sure, that sounds like a problem. But if you take a step back, these distortions can actually give us a window into the cultural fragments they're built from. Think about it. The hallucinations aren't random. They're generated from billions of pieces of data we've created. Social media posts, books, movies, memes, all of it feeds into these systems. And in turn, they spit out something that's, a reflection of our collective imagination. It's like Joanna Zielinska's idea of warped dreaming. These artificially created stories capture a kind of truth, even if it's distorted. They show the aspirations, contradictions, and values embedded in our culture, whether we're aware of them or not. And that's where it gets really fascinating because these AI outputs aren't just nonsense, they're synthetic mirrors. James Bridle talks about this as speculative knowledge, almost like AI is revealing something latent, something that's been buried in the noise of all our cultural communication. So instead of dismissing these outputs as errors, what if we treated them as raw material for new kinds of storytelling? Ultimately, Gen AI doesn't just disrupt storytelling, it changes who gets to tell stories and how. The American dream, the way it's been fractured and stretched across generations, almost feels like the perfect case study here. Because as Gen AI creates new myths, intentionally or not, it asks us to think critically about what we've been told, what we believe, and what kind of stories we want to carry forward. So if the American dream really is a kind of story, what happens when that story doesn't work anymore? I mean, if the arc, this promise of struggle, sacrifice, and success, it just doesn't land the way it used to, how do we even begin to reimagine what comes next? This is where narratology becomes way more than an academic tool. It's a way of creating futures, not just interpreting pasts. Think of myths not as static relics, but as living, evolving frameworks. They adapt, shift, and take on new forms depending on the times and the people creating and telling them. When an old myth collapses, it doesn't mean we're left with nothing. It means we have this incredible opportunity to test out new ideas, new arcs, and see what fits. It's like we get to collectively decide what the next chapter looks like. And let's not forget, it's not just about picking up the pieces of the old story and rearranging them. It's about asking big, speculative questions. What if the dream focused on collective care instead of individual success? What if it wasn't about competition or conquest, but about interdependence and shared growth? I mean, these aren't just thought experiments. They're the seeds of new myths. Myths that could actually feel more inclusive and grounded in the realities people face today. What's fascinating is how different tools, things like Gen AI, TikTok stories, even memes, can help us build those myths. Those might not seem like traditional storytelling platforms, but they're shaping narratives nonetheless. They offer fragments of new ideas, hints of possibilities, and narratology gives us a roadmap to make sense of it all, to piece those fragments into something that makes sense and feels meaningful. We are, in so many ways, at the threshold of something major, a moment where we don't just critique the past, but begin to compose what comes after. And I think that's both, exciting and daunting. But what's clear is that the myths we choose to build, to live by, are going to define what kind of future feels possible and who gets to imagine it. So here we are at this crossroads where myth, machine, and method all weave together. It's such a critical moment because the tools we use to interpret and create stories are shaping not just how we see the world, but also what futures we can even imagine. And when we look at how fractured the American dream has become, it's clear we're dealing with more than just cultural nostalgia. We're witnessing really a kind of narrative disruption. Think about it. Myths like the dream have always been evolving, adjusting based on who gets to tell them and what the culture needs. But now, with generative AI in the mix, the process has accelerated. These machines might not understand truth, but what they do, assembling endless permutations of language, forces us to confront the raw, unfiltered fragments of our collective psyche. They reflect, distort, and inspire all at once. And that's where the method comes in. Narratology offers us a way to process this chaos, to sort through the fragments generated by these systems and by us, and structure them into meaningful forms. It helps us see patterns, ask questions, and ultimately decide what myths we want, not just to inherit, but to create. Because at the heart of this convergence is choice. What kind of stories are worth telling? And who gets to be part of them? To me, the most exciting part of this conversation is what comes next. We're not just spectators watching myths evolve. We're active participants, shaping how myth, machine, and method converge to build new cultural frameworks. And as messy as this moment might feel, it's also full of possibility. The future is unwritten, but it's ours to compose. And that's all for today. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the American dream, its fractures, and the potential paths ahead. I hope it's sparked some new ways of thinking about the stories we tell and the ones yet to be told. Until next time, take care. Until next.